Hello everybody. It is July 14th, 2025 here in the United States of America. And in today's video I want to talk about the announcement made by President Donald Trump in regards to continued sanctions against Russia and the frustration that Donald Trump is having with his inability to actually end the war between Ukraine and Russia, which has been going on since February of 2022. Now, before President Trump officially came in office, he declared that he would be able to end the war within 24 hours. Although this was hyperbole, Trump did expect to come in and strike a deal very quickly. But at this late stage of the conflict, I think that was too little too late. I think President Trump overestimated his ability to make a deal, and I think he overestimated the amount of leverage he actually has over both parties. Ukrainian leadership has resolved itself to fight to the bitter end, regardless if that bitter end is, the recapture of all their lost territories or the capture of Kiev by the Russians, whichever comes first. But they are resolved to fight to the bitter end and not to capitulate. At least this current Ukrainian government. That could always change as discontent within the country over the war continues to grow, which it is growing. Russia has also resolved itself to fight this war to its conclusion, or a conclusion that Russia finds politically acceptable, given the amount of blood and treasure that it has spent on this war. People need to keep in mind that Russia is not going to end this war until it is absolutely certain that Ukraine will not be armed with NATO weaponry or become a member of NATO, and Russia must get to the point where it no longer sees Ukraine as a base of operations for NATO and a threat directly on its border. Both countries are now in a very hardened position in regards to this war and have both resolved to continue this war. Ukraine has resolved itself to continue fighting this war despite immense losses of men and material, and although this war has been costly to Russia, it has not been costly enough with men and material to actually start to cause any kind of political turmoil and upheaval in Russia. Many Russians see this war as something that must be concluded, something that must be fought to the bitter end on the battlefield, and they're willing to do so to protect themselves from what they see as Western encroachment on their borders. Again, this is the Russian point of view on it. Now, President Trump, I think, assumed that he would, come into office and be able to work out some kind of deal. Like, the Russians would be happy with the land that they have. Ukraine would be willing. The Ukrainian leadership would be willing to see reason and understand that continuing the war as it is pointless, and that peace is better than continued destruction. But again, as I mentioned before, I think Trump vastly overestimated his own abilities to bring about peace here. It doesn't really understand the root historical causes of this conflict. This isn't something as simple as just two countries shooting each other over a minor disagreement. The reasons for this war date back decades, if not longer. There's some pretty deep-seated resentment between some Ukrainians and Russians that I do believe fuels this war, and I think Trump has become very frustrated with his inability to find any kind of leverage, specifically on Vladimir Putin, to get Putin to agree to any kind of ceasefire. Now, the Russians have laid out, pretty concisely their reasons for not wanting to sign any kind of ceasefire. They say that it will be used as an opportunity for Ukraine to rearm and dig new defenses, and then the war would just continue anyways, with the Russians in a much more difficult position. This is a reasonable position for any kind of leadership of a country currently at war to take. This is a very rational and reasonable position to hold. I think any country in Russia's position would probably come to the same conclusion. Why give your adversary time to improve any advantages that he may have? Or why give your enemy time to improve their positions? And I think President Putin has made it pretty clear that an immediate ceasefire with no real plan to bring about some kind of permanent peace that the Russian leadership can live with is just off the table. Now, one of the issues is the West has been scrambling to find any kind of leverage that it can over the Russian Federation since 2022. Everyone assumed, Western leadership assumed, that the sanctions would be successful, that it would crash Russia's economy, crash its military. Well, they vastly underestimated Russia to the point where it's comical. You had Western, so-called experts talking about how Russia was going to run out of missiles and munitions in 2 weeks. This war is in its third year now, and Russia is outproducing the totality of the West in regards to ammunition and shells and war materials. They vastly underestimated the Russian economy. This is not the Russia of the 1990s. Economic sanctions would have destroyed the Russia of the 1990s, but this is the Russian Federation of the 2020s. It's a completely different country. They vastly underestimated the Russian military. And now people need to keep in mind, and this really upsets me when people say this, well, Russia can't even defeat a little country like Ukraine, all these Russians are idiots. First of all, Ukraine is one of the largest, I believe, if not the largest country in Europe outside of Russia. It's a very large country by most country standards. It's, I think, the size of Texas, if not bigger. And currently at this point, they also have the most battle-hardened, experienced, well-armed, and largest military in Europe. Okay, they're no slouch. The Ukrainians are fighting bravely and honorably. Although they're struggling quite a bit, I would put money on Ukraine winning any direct conflict against any other European power. The Russians are, I believe, clearly winning, but the Ukrainians are putting up a very, very good fight, a better fight than any other European power would at this point. So it does bother me a good bit when people make this suggestion that, well, Ukraine's a joke and Russia can't even beat them. Pretty sure the Ukrainians would wipe the floor with the French and the Germans at this point. It wouldn't even be close. So let's hope when this war is over that all of the angry Western Ukrainian nationalists don't decide to turn their ire westward and take revenge for being abandoned, which is a very real possibility. But anyways, President Trump can't find any real leverage over Russia. Russia is one of the three great world powers. The United States, China, and Russia are the three preeminent world powers. Now, Russia, out of the big three, is probably the weakest. It's still much more powerful than most other countries, and its military at this point is the most experienced and battle-tested military on the planet. So although they might not have a population of the United States and China, and their economy might not be quite as good as either country, they still are a very formidable nation and cannot be cowed or intimidated by sanctions. And the threat of some kind of direct U.S. military intervention against Russia is such a low possibility that Russia doesn't even really consider it. Now, subterfuge and assassination attempts by the Ukrainian intelligence services with the backing of the United States is a very real threat, but insofar as B-2 bombers launching airstrikes against Moscow, it's not going to happen to be suicide for everybody. So what leverage does President Trump have? And I think this kind of shows, this announcement, which I'll get into, that he's kind of reaching for straws, unfortunately, in this conflict, or grasping at straws. The threat is that he'll impose 100% tariffs after a period of 50 days if no ceasefire is reached, which 50 days is a long time, and Russia's offensive is going forward at full steam. They're beginning to finally really chew through the Donbass defenses in earnest. If you don't believe me, just look at the military summary channel maps. Every day you look at it, there's new advances. And there have been wide complaints about mass desertion within the Ukrainian army. Like I mentioned before, they are fighting very bravely. But at some point, no matter how good your army is and how bravely it fights, it reaches a breaking point. At the end of World War II, the German army was still formidable. It could still put up a fight. But at that point, it was so exhausted and tired from the war that it just gave up. Now, they still could fight. They could have extended that war for, another few months, maybe a year, depending on the terrain they were defending. They've had enough at that point. we're getting closer to that point where the Ukrainian army is going to experience that kind of collapse, even with the advent of new Western weapons, which this is also something that President Trump spoke about. Giving the Ukrainians more Patriots. Well, it's all well and good, but if Russia is sending in 700-800 drones at a time per attack, and many of those are dummies, then what good are the Patriots going to do? The Patriot systems will be exhausted within a few nights of air raids, and they're extremely expensive. They'll be used up very quickly by the Ukrainians. The fact is, no matter what material the West just gives the Ukrainians at this point, a beaten and depleted military can't really take advantage of those materials. I mean, imagine if somebody just magically shipped in, 500 more Tiger tanks to the Germans in 1941. Would it have made, or 1945? Would it have made a difference at that point? Probably not. Now, insofar as the sanctions, President Trump is now trying to leverage countries that are allied or friendly with with the Russian Federation to. What this is meant to do is to try to get China and India, specifically China, to try to urge the Russians to finally end the war, because China wouldn't want to pay 100% tariffs during trade with the United States. What the announcement comes down to is anybody who imports oil or energy from Russia will face a 100% tariff. Now, it's quite a few countries. Two of those countries are extremely powerful. China, which is one of the big three, and India, which I would say is within the top 10 at least. So the United States is trying to essentially economically blackmail those countries into pushing the Russians to finally end the war, to put political pressure on the Russians. Say, hey, listen, we're not trying to pay these 100% tariffs. It's going to hurt our economies. You need to put a stop to this war, because again, like I said before, Trump has no direct leverage over Russia to try to end the war. What he can do is try to leverage Russia's allies or friendly nations with Russia to try to push Russia to end the war. Now, I think this is unnecessary and foolish. I think much of this is coming from the neocon camp of the Republican Party and these think tanks in Washington. Think tanks that don't really think about the long-term ramifications of the decisions they make, which frankly they don't. Almost every decision made by the neocon think tanks in Washington in the last 30 years has had horrendous unintended or unexpected consequences, 5, 10, 15 years down the road, and I think this is just another one of those decisions, unfortunately. I think it would undo all of the trade negotiations that President Trump just had with China. What if China decides to say that no one is going to tell us how to run our foreign policy? China's in that position now where it can say that. India's in that position now where it can say that. They're not dependent completely on the United States. There is an entire world economy within the global South that has become more and more independent from the United States. One of the consequences of policies like this, and this happened under Biden, I think when it reached its zenith, was that countries know that if they're dependent on the dollar or they trade in the dollar, they are vulnerable to sanctions from the United States, and no country wants to have a perpetual loaded gun to its head economically, which is why many countries are moving away from the dollar as quickly as they can. This is why BRICS exists, and the reason why BRICS exists is because of U.S. sanctions in the first place, and this will just incentivize more and more nations within the global South to cut themselves off from the U.S. dollar, which would hurt the United States economy in the long run. It would destroy the dollar's spot as the world reserve currency, and I feel like President Trump is desperately trying to ensure that that doesn't happen, but his efforts to make sure that that doesn't happen might very well bring about the thing that they fear happening. And this has been kind of the hallmark of American foreign policy over the last 30 years, is the threat that American foreign policy has tried to stop has brought about that very thing to finally happen. Russia has entered an ascendancy within on the world stage. It's now much more powerful than it has been. Much of this has been a reaction to NATO, U.S. foreign policy, and NATO. Russia wouldn't feel the need to arm itself the way that it has. Russia wouldn't have the battlefield experience that it has if this issue in Ukraine wouldn't have happened in 2014. But now the neocons are facing a resurgent Russia. They are desperate to destroy. China, same thing. Many U.S. policies have caused China to become the way that it is today. militarized and preparing for, not militarized, but preparing for a fight with the United States and seeking every conceivable advantage against a power they view as perpetually hostile. But just to kind of get back on track here, I don't think this tariff announcement will do much of anything. I think India and China won't cave to U.S. pressure on this. I think at a certain point, other great powers will put their foot down and declare that, okay, this is now a multipolar world. The United States does not occupy the position of hegemon. Who are they to dictate our foreign policy and who we can trade with? Will they choose their relationship with Russia over the United States, considering that the United States foreign policy seems to be constantly attempting to blackmail them, perpetually potentially hostile towards them? The United States, unfortunately, the U.S. government might be, their foreign policy might be creating, I don't want to say an alliance, but BRICS exists for a reason, but there is a solid block of nations, I believe, that are going to form in opposition to the United States over this attempt to remain at least not quite a hegemon, but the dominant of the three world powers. I don't think at this point the United States is able to do that. Much of the world is caught up to us militarily, technologically, and economically. And I think that President Trump has yet to, and I think this is because of his advisors. I'm not saying he's a terrible president or anything. I'm just saying that these decisions seem to be based off of the old way of thinking in Washington and not the reality on the ground, the reality that currently exists within Russia, China, and India, the reality of the war in Ukraine, the reality of the conflicts in the Middle East. I think many of these decisions aren't being made with forethought to what could happen down the line, which is now why I think the U.S. government is resorting to blackmailing economically countries to try to force Russia to end the war instead of dealing with Russia directly. And this proposal from Lindsey Graham for a 500% tariff on any country importing energy from Russia would be suicidal stupidity. At that point, these countries would absolutely say, no way. Watch. Good. 500%. 500% tariffs, good. Let's see whose economy blinks first, and it won't be China's, and it probably won't be India's. It'll be the United States, because politically, Trump's entire presidency and the midterms and the future of the Republican Party depend on the United States economy remaining stable, continuing to grow and continuing to improve. And if these 500% tariffs are, from Lindsey Graham, are introduced, there's a real solid chance that if India and China decide not to play ball and say, screw it, let's see whose economy crashes first, it's going to put the United States and our current political leadership in a very dire position, and they know that. People that run these other countries aren't stupid. They understand American politics and the precarious position that the Republican Party does find itself in, especially with some of the pushback it's been getting from its base over some of the domestic decisions and foreign policy decisions made in the last few weeks, in regards to these airstrikes in Iran and the handling of the Epstein files. But anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about tonight. Hope everyone out there has a great evening, and I will be back with another video Wednesday.